So record is now on. So hello, Paul.
Hello, Flemming.
So we're leaving it sort of open, but I'm hoping we'll talk about, in part inspired by your recent article about collective intelligence, which is one of my big pet interests, and maybe going deeper in that. Does it is that enough, or how is that going to work?
Yeah, it
Or
sounds like a good starting point.
yeah.
Yeah.
So I'm just gonna. I mean, I just read your article. For everybody else, it's called "Transcending Existential Risks with Collective Intelligence," which I thought perfectly good. There's nothing I disagree about, and sort of I agree that some kind of self-organizing collective intelligence is the answer to a hell of a lot of things. And you point out liquid democracy as part of the answer to that, which I also agree with.
Yeah, liquid democracy, what I think is brilliant about the underlying logic is if it's done right, it allows there to be a scaling of agency, among other things. A scaling of a lot of things, but because we each as individuals, we're limited in what we can do, we're limited in the time we have. And so liquid democracy allows every human being on the planet to delegate and as a result possibly upregulate huge amounts of what needs to happen. So if I say, for example, that I want to see an increase in the the deployment of things like renewable energy, right now we have somewhat limited options. We can try to vote for the right candidates, and it's the nature of the political system that if I happen to vote for the right candidate and that candidate happens to have enough influence that they might be able to influence policy in some direction that ultimately results in the change that I want to see. But so in other words, it's very quantized. But with liquid democracy, it allows for more nuance. So I could say, okay, this is my feeling, but I don't know enough about this, so I'm going to go ahead and delegate my agency to certain people I trust, and they in turn might do the same thing. And that type of system has the potential to engender more nuanced policy. So it's not a one size fits all. Mm-hmm. Rather, it's like let's say you have 40% of the people that want to see an upregulation of solar power, for example, then you get it to the degree that people want that. And it doesn't have to necessarily be political. It could be financing, money, activism, all sorts of things can happen through that. So to me, it's an essential component, at least as I understand it currently.
So it's essentially that one has the choice: either one directly votes on whatever one wants, or one delegates it to somebody else who knows better, and one can revoke it essentially at any time, which I think is a key.
It's very important. Yes.
So I totally agree with that. I have maybe issues about how practically to do that. Like, I mean, there are many voting systems where it easily becomes a bit of a scam, or no, not a sort of a. You're voting for things you don't really know what are. And in principle, this is to avoid that, but it requires that you have some kind of feedback and information back. Like I'm thinking about, well, in my kid's school, whenever there's time to elect some like parents, teachers, parent representatives or something like that, I always get a list of names of people I don't know that are like, here's Mr. Jones and Mrs. Smith and Mrs. Hanson. Who do you vote for? And they don't say anything, and I know nothing about them. I have no idea. So I'd either pick somebody randomly, or I just refrain from participating, even though I obviously have some input, but I don't really know because there's no mechanism for knowing. So it's sort of a key piece that you somehow have a system of awareness or feedback of who knows, so who's doing good stuff.
Yeah, I think this liquid democracy sort of solves that problem because with that system, it's you're electing somebody and then they have authority for the next year, 2 years, however long it is. With liquid democracy, it's real time all the time, which means
But then I sort of need to see what they do. Because so like in this case, if I picked Mrs. Hansen for the parent teachers meeting, even if I could revoke it, I don't really know what they're doing. I sort of need to sort of see.
Yeah, you need feedback. Yeah, of course. I think feedback is essential for it to work, and that's kind of where reputation comes in. Is the reputation is essentially your feedback. You're getting it's based on accurate sense making. Like what are they doing, and as a result, do I have enough information to make an informed decision? To who to delegate my vote to? Because at any moment you can vote yourself. You don't have to elect anybody. If you just don't know who to vote for, then you cast your vote yourself directly. And so that's the thing about liquid democracy is on the one level, it's one side of the spectrum, it's direct democracy. Everybody can vote directly. And on the other end, it's representational because you can delegate who can delegate. And so, but the beauty of it is it's always in real time. So that means that anytime a decision or a vote needs to be held on a bill, a policy, a change in something, at any given time, anybody can vote or can delegate their vote and so on. That's the first thing. And then the second thing is, of course, that there needs to be good sense making. So that's the other side, obviously, is that hopefully with liquid democracy, we can, and this is why, okay, so this is how I see liquid democracy and sense making working together, which is that everybody's a sense maker in some sense. Everybody's out there seeing the world. Not everybody necessarily shares their perception of the world, but a lot of people choose to do so. And we can, part of the, I guess you would say part of the system, if you think of it as a social network, is that what I'm actually receiving or information that I'm getting can be filtered through that sense-making liquid democracy network, which means that people who have proven to be the most reliable in terms of telling me what's going on are going to be the ones that I'm more likely to see and more likely to get my information.
Yeah, and again, I totally think it's a great idea, but the trickiest part might actually be how do I get good feedback, or how do I see it correctly rather than just being campaigned to, like in a current sort of environment. Even if there was liquid democracy, a lot of people would choose Donald Trump to be their representative for everything just because something. It seems like he's doing well, and he says he's doing great, and I trust him. And
that's true. Yeah, that's true. And part of that, I think, part of the reason that he gets so upregulated in the current system is because he's figured out how to hijack the current centralized system. Like, I mean, he has the money and the resources to get attention on television.
Yeah,
and there's the broadcast media, and then of course he has the money to influence social media campaigns to some extent.
Yeah.
So,
and also I don't have direct input. I mean, what he's doing some things, or maybe he's not doing very much. It's not very clear. Like, so people sort of trust what he's saying. We're accomplishing a lot. I mean, one thing after the other. And they're like, yeah, he's getting all these things done that nobody else got done. Because they can't see for themselves. They don't know how to look. There's no good way of presenting complex things like that. Is the economy better or not? Are there more jobs or not? Are the poor people better off or not? It's sort of hearsay. They
right.
Most people don't have a way of sort of checking for themselves. If they could see the result right away, which they can't.
So I want to agree with that, which is that our current sense making capabilities are seriously compromised. They're not working very well. I mean, obviously, we live in a post-fact, post-truth, environment where you have no idea who to trust. You have no idea what information is accurate. If you look at something like Syria, there's at least 5 different narratives, all of which have some actual substance to those narratives, but they all can't be true. Yeah. And so it's like, at this point, I honestly don't know anyone at all who actually knows. And if they do, I don't know that they know. I can't trust them.
It's hard
So
to know the
it's
difference. Like what's really
yeah,
going
so,
on in Syria
yeah,
is
yeah. So and it's
yep.
interesting because I have a friend who responded to me privately to my article, which is what that was one of his concerns was that one of his concerns with self-organizing collective intelligence, as I outlined in this paper, is that it could further reinforce these feedback loops of isolation and distraction and so on. And he's right about that on some level, but on another level, and this is kind of, and I'm going to jump ship, just go adjacent here for a minute, which is that when I take a higher view, a bird's eye view, as it were, is that what we end up with is sort of this ecosystem or fitness landscape of different competing SOCIs. So self-organizing collective intelligence. We get these different sense-making apparatuses, these different agency, all these different things, and they're all sort of competing in some sense. And it's my thesis, could be wrong, but it's my thesis that those SOCIs who are capable of accurate sense-making will end up being more effective because they have actionable intelligence versus those that don't. So those that get isolated into some bizarre delusional, self-reinforcing group mind, have essentially isolated themselves from accurate sense making, and as a result, they're sort of wandering around blind. So my thesis is that in a system of competing SOCIs, there are many things that will happen, but one of them is that those that are more capable of accurate sense making will be the ones that tend to thrive and grow.
Okay, I would like it to be that way, and I think it would be that way if somehow their boundaries were clear. Like if we said like one city-state had one self-organizing collective intelligence, another one had another, we could see which one does best, but they're sort of overlapping.
Yes.
So we can see in the US, the collective intelligence around Trump will have its own feedback loop that says it's doing great. We're all doing better, and then they elect him again. And if anything goes wrong, it's like, oh, these dumb Democrats, they're hacking the election process or whatever it is. Like they will have answers to it. So things have to be totally go down the drain before they're sort of.
Yeah, I think it's problematic if you have these emerging SOCIs coming up against existing bureaucratic democratic institutions, meaning you have one guy or gal who's running the country. As long as you have one person who we still put up there as the alpha male, female, who can run the country with their minions, you're still stuck with a hierarchical organization, and you have SOCIs. So this brings up an even more interesting thing is in the midst of hierarchical organizations or centralized organizations and the rise of these decentralized SOCI systems, who wins? And again, my thesis there is that the decentralized systems work for a wide variety of reasons. Jordan had talked about QAnon, and I think it's a great case in point. With QAnon, clearly, from most people's perspective, they are entertaining what could very well be just complete disinformation. It's a complete psyop. Most of their information is relying from one individual or a group of individuals under one name. So already that's a huge red flag. Mm-hmm. And who happens to be speaking a language that is very appealing to people's pre-existing biases. Yeah. So you're getting this sort of confirmation bias feedback system, exactly what my friend talked about. So that's the downside. But despite that, as Jordan pointed out, it's actually succeeding on some level in changing the narrative and in changing the direction of the Republican Party. It's begun hijacking it. In fact, you see that the Republican Party has become, it's a lot of the I would call them the establishment GOP, the old GOP, the grand old party. All those guys are sort of getting pushed aside. They're either having to leave the party or they're having to change their tune to sort of appease this in part 4chan influenced narrative, whether it's Pepe the Frog or all these other things. And so, as Jordan pointed out again, he says we're looking at essentially like an early primitive iteration of this collective intelligence. And despite how primitive it is and even potentially delusional it is, it's still effective at disrupting and having power over these existing establishment centralized systems.
Yeah, well, so I mean, no doubt it's effective in sort of grabbing the mind share and the media share. So it's just what I'm lacking, which I don't have an answer for. I mean, as I said before, if it was connected with that, the resources and your livelihood, and it was somehow there was the boundary around it, we would see if it works. But here, it's possible to influence the narrative for something you have no real part in necessarily, which it sort of hides who actually makes things work and who makes them not work. So it makes it look like something totally different.
Yeah.
And one can get away with that without necessarily reaping the consequences. It's sort of like trolling. I mean, you're not there to sort of receive the karma afterwards. You just sort of hijack the narrative, and somebody else will sort of do the cleanup and pay the bill afterwards.
Right. I think okay. So one of the things that so this all comes back to sense making, which I'm going to repeat my thesis, which is that those Sokis who have the most accurate sense making are the most effective because they have actual real information that's actionable. If you're acting on delusions, if you have one entity that's acting on false or bad information and one that's acting on good information, over time, the one that has better information would seem to be more competitive.
Well, I would like that to be true, but I think maybe we need to sort of tweak something to make it come out that way.
You're probably right. So one of the things is, okay. So Paul, where do you get accurate sense making? And Jordan mentioned this again. It's funny because I've always had a bad taste in my mouth with IoT, Internet of Things. Mm-hmm. Something about it always bothered me, especially this idea of centralized IoT, which is essentially a backdoor for all sorts of nefarious bad actors to get into every goddamn device I have in my house. Yeah. So, like for example, I'm a person who absolutely does not have an Amazon, whatever it is. What do they call that? The Amazon spy device, the surveillance. Alexa.
What time is it? Yeah.
And
5 p.m.
So you have one.
Well, I'm rarely using it. I'm surprised.
I just, it's not that I have nothing to hide. I really don't. But at the same time, I don't like the idea of this listening device that's in my house. Yeah. It's funny because, you look at Amazon and man, they're like really going to town. It's like, you can have a listening device in every corner of your room.
Your bathroom, anywhere.
Yeah, right. And so it's like, I have no problem with that as long as it was well, anyway, I guess my point is that there are projects that are happening. Trying to think of one of them. I know one of them. I'm not sure if it succeeded or it was implemented properly, but one of them is the IOTA blockchain, which is the idea of creating a decentralized Internet of Things. And I think that's where the promise is. If you have a decentralized IOTA and you have things like self-sovereign identity and proper cryptographic things, you can gain all of the advantages of Internet of Things with not necessarily privacy problems. And of course, this brings up the whole privacy thing, which I won't go into. That's a whole other topic. David Brin talks about the transparent society. He makes a lot of strong points there. Yeah. But here's my point. There's a lot of people who, given if there's ubiquitous IoT, are going to want to put up these devices. They're going to want to share what's going on. There's going to be devices that people put up, and it would allow anybody to sort of peek in and see what's going on. It's not the transparency of, it's not the NSA style where only they can see. Yeah. It's creating a network where anybody who's willing to put up a device can see it. And of course, this sounds like, and again, I'm just having a flood of thoughts here. It goes back to that movie that came out recently called Circle. And, and that one, it shows that it's sort of preaching that this is a bad thing because look, these mobs will attack people, and in the movie they go after this guy who just wants to be left alone, and they hound him literally off a cliff or something, and he gets killed. But when you look at what actually happens in those situations, the opposite happens. For example, there was a video that came out recently of this lady who was harassing a woman or a couple of women in a grocery store for being Hispanic. and the public had none of it. They just immediately hounded the lady, get out of here. You like, just leave. People have a real hard time with bullies. I think overall 95%. And so if you see these people who say, hey, let's find this guy, you're going to have a lot more people going, screw you, we're going to help this guy. I don't see that happening, is my point. I have hope that, or faith that generally speaking, what gets engendered is more tolerance for diversity, more tolerance for eccentricity. Yeah. So it's certainly in our society.
Yeah. So I mean, in general, I'm leaning in the direction that total transparency would be a good thing. But I also noticed that even when the correct actual information is available, people don't necessarily go and seek it out. Like, people have endless discussions about, well, global warming, is that just some sort of scam or what? Or is it really, it has always been warming out? I mean, how many people go and look as directly as you can at the actual numbers of it? Is it actually warmer last year and this year? I mean, what's actually going on? It's most people go to some kind of some articles and websites that are sort of on their side arguing for the same thing, rather than going to the source data. So I think in many cases, even though the actual data is there, even if we maybe had direct like video of what's going on in Syria, I'm not sure at this point whether it really would solve it.
Prediction markets. Not saying that's the solution, but that's certainly a solution. One of the things is put your money where your mouth is. If you're going to make a wager, for example, it's like if you're going to say something, put a wager in. One of the cool things about prediction markets is it's gamified and financialized, which means that those people who tend to be right tend to get rewarded. So now the incentive is created for people to try to make good predictions, because if they don't, they ended up losing. They have to put their money where their mouth is, as it were. Or as Nicholas Taleb says, it's skin in the game. You have to put a little skin in the game. So, and again, there's lots of work going on in the blockchain space and other places to create prediction markets. And I think that they are likely to happen because there's so many good reasons for them to happen, and so many opportunities for people to jump in. And when somebody makes a wager, it's like, well, there's global warming now. It's like, okay, well, why don't you make a wager then? And when people start losing these wagers, what are they going to do? They're going to backpedal, but they also start losing money. They start losing reps. And I'm not saying that solves the problem. There's some people that are just so stubborn. I have no reputation. I've been wrong about everything. And I'm telling you I'm wrong about everything. And I'm like, but I love you and I'm going to believe you anyway. I mean, there's some people who are just completely swept in charisma. I mean,
but yeah, if it was somehow gamified like that, if there was an economy in it, a market thing. I mean, if you make a bet and you're right most of the time, then you get a little more sort of mind share, or your numbers go up somehow. Whereas, I mean, the current system, you can get away too easily with just making shit up and like just sort of amplifying it. And the real facts, if they're available on the matter, are just another voice in the darkness.
Yeah, there's no cost incurred to being wrong. So people can, and the other thing is, things like troll armies. So you have these people, it's like, well, if you have a troll army doing it, it's like, well, that person has to have a definitive sort of, blockchain something that says, well, wait a second, what other things have you predicted? Oh, I haven't predicted anything yet. See, I'm whatever. I'm this new person who is telling you. And so this when you start getting these media, the nice thing about cryptography is you could have a encrypted watermark chain of custody, which means that when a piece of media ends up, you can look at the blockchain and see when was it originally put on the blockchain.
Yeah. Has
it been changed? You can check to validate that it's changed. It's easy, anybody can do it. And then that particular information is tied to somebody's cryptographic hash, and which is tied to other things they've done. It's like, okay, this person's putting out a thing about Syria, and they've been 80% right with 36 predictions.
Yeah, so I think we need something like that, but at the same time, we need to care about it. I mean, you and I can easily agree that most of what Donald Trump says, he just sort of makes it up, and then he says the next day, no, he never said that. And even no matter how many fact checkers point out, well, here's it on video, you said it yesterday. It's most people who listen, who already believe in Donald Trump, will say, well, it's just the media making shit up again. So the question is how we make people care about a system. It does make a system, but it's also how do we actually make it count?
Right. So I mean, on the one hand, there's the mindset change. How do you get people's mindset to change? And I think that's hard. I don't have the answer to that. The other side of it is how do you create the right incentives for people to want to change? Meaning, like, I want to be able to. There's an incentive, some incentive for me to want to see things act.
So if it can be built into some kind of economy, I mean, if you make more money or you get better sex or something happens, if you're right, then so the problem is there are no consequences, or a few consequences. No.
Yeah, I think all of the solutions that I'm throwing out help, but I don't necessarily think they necessarily solve it. But I think they can certainly move things more in the right direction. We sort of shift the tide a little bit. I think creating the right incentives, creating things like prediction markets, things like reputation, liquid democracy, and transparency, I think over time tend to engender a shift of more people towards these more accurate sense-making things.
Yeah.
But again, is it enough to get everybody?
No.
I don't know. And that comes back to the bigger playing field as if we have a minority of people who are caught up in delusional sense making and in a sufficient, or better yet, it's just a sufficient critical mass of minority people who have accurate sense making.
Well, if we go back to your idea that there's sort of a competition going on between different collective intelligence. So, I mean, even if not everybody buys into it, even if we only get like 5% of people to buy into a system that's based on facts and verification and trust and seeing what actually is there. If that group can be more effective, it can potentially outcompete the other ones. So the task might just mean to make one collective intelligence well enough that it works better than the other ones, but.
Yeah, this goes deep. What this reminds me of is evolutionary stable strategies, and I'm not sure if you're familiar with what that is.
Better refresh me.
Okay, so and if Brett's watching, he might correct me. But an evolutionary stable strategy is a strategy that, once adopted, ends up becoming dominant because it's the most stable. Mm-hmm. So the idea is that even if in a population of, say, 1,000 entities, 1,000 penguins, 1,000 birds, whatever, if two birds, just two, let's say, adapt an evolutionary stable strategy, that over time that all the birds will end up adapting that strategy. So it's competitive on multiple levels. Not only is it just competitive generally, but it's competitive with all other strategies, which means that it ends up crowding out all the other strategies. Mm-hmm. And taking that concept and applying it to self-organizing collective intelligence, my thesis is that what ends up being the most evolutionary stable strategy that I can conceive of self-organizing collective intelligence is one that has more empathy, one that has more accurate sense-making, and has more effective agency than the other ones. And so over time, assuming I'm thinking of this correctly, that strategy will end up becoming the dominant strategy, that all other strategies will end up getting outcompeted. I believe pretty strongly that's the case. My concern and my question is, can that shift happen soon enough before civilization goes off a cliff? Mm-hmm. Irrevocably, irreversibly, before it collapses in an irreversible direction? I don't know. And this brings up the bigger topic of is how much time do we really have? Jordan thinks it's 80 months, 7 years. The article that I posted to is less than 10. Paul Hawkins, a well-known talk speaker on this, says we have 30 years or more. He says that in 30 years we can completely reverse it. I think it's true. If we have 30 years, I think we can completely reverse it. All the trends are going in that direction. In fact, I think it's within 2 years, solar power will be cheaper than fossil fuels. That's shocking. I expect it to take longer. And so the idea is if current trends continue, and this is according to very conservative banks who talk about this market, have predicted that by 2030, the world will be shifting pretty much more and more to renewables, meaning that fossil fuels and anything that's bad will be just completely out. It will become even more expensive, not just to build them, but just to keep them running. That'll be cheaper to actually deconstruct them and put solar panels there by 2030. So we end up getting a radical shift, phase shift essentially into renewables. And that's going to make a huge dent. I mean, a huge dent. If you combine that with things like, what is it, MH3, I think it is, for boats, and the power of electric engines, pretty soon, I think they were saying within 10 to 15 years, the electric engines and battery capacity will be such that you can have, intercontinental electric airplanes, something like 10 to 15 years. All of that bodes very well for us in terms of the energy and carbon footprint, but it may not come soon enough. That's the big mystery. That's the next thing I'd like to talk about. But before we go there, we can keep talking about SOGI stuff.
So, and I'm not sure I even find it all that well. Of course, it's relevant, but I mean, in my mind, I mean, if we have a working collective intelligence, generally speaking, and we reverse the trend of human stupidity, if we actually on any level start getting our act together, it's not too late. I mean, even if it was that the planet was 10 degrees warmer or something, I mean, there's possible answers to that. I mean, if we do nothing, then lots of things are going to fall apart. But if we manage to get our act together in terms of working together and applying the solutions we have, I mean, lots of things are possible. We can go off planet and live underwater and
absolutely,
lots of things. It's just right now we don't have the mechanisms at all for like applying good.
Yeah, I think assuming we can make it, the grand prize is truly grand. And I don't think I'm exaggerating by saying it is literally a golden age in so many ways that we can't even imagine. Yeah. And I know I hesitate to say that because people say, oh, come on, we've heard that for years, but I really don't mean that sincerely. If we can, assuming we can sort of transition past this technological adolescence, the bounty is unbelievable.
I mean, and in principle, we don't have to work. You can do whatever you dream.
Total age of society, indefinite life extension, potential to travel anywhere in the world, in the universe, in other words, interstellar travel. Just the solar system alone, the space between just the L4, L5 regions of the moon can hold over 1 trillion people. And when I say 1 trillion people, I'm not talking dense. We're talking like super spread out. You know, the nearest colony is like 500 miles away. So when you look in the night sky, you see a few other stars that are nearby colonies.
Yeah,
just at that density, it's 1 trillion.
Yeah.
And then if you go out to the L4, L5 regions of the sun, which means the sun, Earth, L4, L5 regions, the volume of those L4, L5 regions, based on my calculations that I did about a few months ago, is over 100 trillion. So it's like you could have just millions of different societies and experimentations. It's just amazing to me what's possible.
Yeah.
So to me, that's why it's so much worth fighting, because but here's my concern. And I think this is something that Jordan would agree with, which is that our current system is so fragile. It's complicated, as he says. It's complicated versus complex. It's fragile, that should there be 2 or 3 degrees warming, or should there be, these kinds of system shocks that we're talking about, that the fragile system could collapse sufficiently that the minimal civilization structure, civil order, whatever, is insufficient to build the necessary things like collective intelligence, space exploration, all those kinds of things start to fall apart. They're very the idea is they're very dependent on these vulnerable systems.
Yeah.
So that's the concern for me too, is that that we may not be able to transition to a more robust, deeply adaptive civilizational system before things start to collapse.
Yeah.
So to be honest, up until I'd say about 2 years ago, I was like super optimistic. I was always the guy arguing on the side of, oh, no, here's how we can do it. We can do this, we can do this, we can do this. Because I didn't hear people talking about solutions. They just said, we're all doomed. And like, well, what about this? What about that? What about that? And the last couple of years has changed my view on that. Partly from the election of Donald Trump, and not just Donald Trump, but just the reaction of the political sphere on both sides was so toxic. I'm like, what the hell is going on? I mean, I can't. It's like I was living in a dream of most people are rational and reasonable, and then waking up to realize that most people around me don't seem to be rational or reasonable at all.
Not at all. That's not.
And I was shocked. I was like, have I been living inside a bubble? I've been living in my own bubble that I thought most people were basically reasonable.
Yeah.
If I had a different point of view that was even slightly critical of their candidate, I was called every name in the book. It was shocking. I'd never seen that before. I thought, yeah, well, here's my point of view. You could say, well, that's not true. Here's why. It was, you are and just, I mean, people who are otherwise really smart. People I've actually met in person who I always have had a civil relationship with. And so that sort of was very disappointing. I don't want to say disappointing. That's not even the word. It was very disheartening. I actually just got really dispirited. I to the point of actually just shedding tears. I was so upset at what I thought was it was like watching. I don't know how to describe it. It was like death. It was like watching something that I thought had always existed die. Either it did exist and it died, or I had an illusion that it was, and my illusion has been popped.
Yeah. So, but now that we know that people are not as rational as we thought they were, well, the job is sort of the same. It's just we can't count on just spreading the good news of what's really going on, or something. I mean, that's not going to do it. I mean, and it's still sort of the same Buckminster Fuller type of answer. I mean, it's not convincing people. It's inventing something, creating something, some system, some gadget, some symbol even. I mean, something that makes people behave differently because it's just cool to use this new way of doing it. So, I mean, that's still sort of the same answer. We don't have to convince these 7 billion people, however many there are. We have to convince a very small number, and we have to spread some kind of something that's a solution, a system, an approach, a gadget. I don't know what, but in a certain way that hasn't changed. It's just you can't count.
Yeah, you're right.
With you.
Yeah, it's the trim tab, right? Where's the trim tab in the human civilization? Who are the key people that you can have an influence on? That could help maybe amplify what you think is the right thing to do.
Yeah.
And that's certainly one thing that I feel that one goal that I have is find centers of influence, given my limited resources, and see if I can have a positive influence on that. And I could say, looking back, have been mixed results. Sometimes people like, whoa. Wow, certainly collective intelligence has been one of those memes that seems to have that result. People are sort of shocked and surprised that even such a thing is possible.
Yeah.
For example, until recently, most everyone that I spoke to, and this is people who are really smart about it, can't imagine collective intelligence or even the idea of it without it conflating it with the Borg, or some idea of that individual agency and potential is sacrificed. That so strong is this idea that the idea that it's the opposite, it's anti-collectivist and individually empowering, is sort of mind-boggling to people. And so this is actually the reason that I was invited to speak at Voice and Exit, was to speak to that specifically, to that idea.
Yeah, because that's surprising to some people, counterintuitive, but to me very integral in it. I mean, it's to amplify individual agency. It's each of us doing our thing more cleanly and
Right.
finding a way of having that interact on a
Yeah,
higher level.
it's stigmergy in action, which is
Yeah.
and stigmergy, for those who don't know what that is a is a sort of bottoms up emergent order that occurs in groups of agents, or things like birds and fish. People think, oh, the fish are all caught in this matrix, they're all sort of slaves to the fish, and I'm like, that's not actually
They're doing
what's
their thing,
happening.
like
The
ants,
fish
just walking around doing their thing.
the fish can certainly break away at any time. The fish says, hey, wait a second, if I go off on my own, I have to do all the work. I have to have 360 vision about where the good food is, where the predators are, and I'm going to get eaten. But if I collectively, if I cohere into this school of fish, I have the eyes and sense making apparatus of all of the fish who are collectively able to do it. So any one individual fish only needs to spend a little bit of its energy, its resources, on looking at the landscape. So if there happens to be a predator, all it takes is one of the 10,000 fish to notice the shark. That fish makes a move, and then the next fish, they've studied this, the next few fish, and this happens very quickly in like just milliseconds or tenths of a second. The first fish makes a change, and the next fish will sort of instinctively change, but they also verify. So they wait, where are we changing? Because they've done studies where if one fish moves and there's no threat, did the other fish move? No. But if one fish moves and the next 10 to 15 fish see that signal and go, wait, what is he looking at? Oh, there is a shark, and then they move. There's a certain threshold. I'm not sure the exact number, it varies, but there's a certain minimal threshold when enough fish turn that it ends up upregulating through the whole school, and the whole school starts to shift around the shark. That's one way that collective intelligence works. But it's totally not a hive mind. It's completely voluntary and participatory, and by participating, you get a lot more than if you didn't participate.
Yeah. So I mean, part of what I see as an obstacle is sort of like, I mean, it really requires that each unit is independently moving. It requires that each fish is not attached with strings to the other fish. It actually can do whatever it wants, but it responds to the signals. And we humans are actually a lot less independent than we think we are. We're sort of used to responding to, with strings attached to us, to the news or to social media and so forth. We're not so independently moving any longer. So in a certain way, we need to find our way back to, okay, what is actually my own range of movement? What do I actually feel like doing all by myself? Which we're kind of we're not used to doing that. So we need to sort of remove all the sort of layers of how we are attached to everything else. I think for collective intelligence to really work, we need to be more independent, each of us, more sovereign, more free to do our things. So that means to have some idea of what our thing is and what we really want to do, which to many people is kind of far away. You're responding to the news, not to what your own desires and resources and capabilities are. So,
well, there's a lot of good news there. If a school of fish was operating hierarchically, they would be outcompeted and eaten by the fish that operated independently in stigmergy. So the reason we don't see hierarchical fish schools is because if there were any, they're gone. They got eaten. The school turned out to be an evolutionary stable strategy. And so applied to the human sphere, and this brings up a wonderful case in point, which is we see what's happening in China now with the social credit system. They've created this reputation system, social credit. It's completely centrally managed, and the entire reputation score, who gauges the reputation, and the repercussions of what you do in that social system is completely controlled in a completely top-down fashion. So from one perspective, it's the perfect tyranny. It allows for absolute control.
Yeah.
Like a polished crystal, you can completely control the horizontal, the vertical, everything. You can just you can manipulate whole populations so easily. It's incredible. And on the one hand, it's a totalitarian dream come true. But again, going back to that bird's eye view and assuming that the US could implement a decentralized, self-organizing collective intelligence where reputation is done properly in that system, and not the way that it's done in, for example, that episode of Black Mirror called Nosedive, where it's a perfect example. You have one reputation score, just one, and they're rating you without any nuance or granularity. My interaction with you was a 2. Well, what was that about? What did it have to do with anything? And so everybody's competing, and it's centrally managed, except everybody's voting. But there's no intelligence there. It's just blind reputation, and so the results are going to inevitable. You end up with that system. So obviously, if reputation is done correctly, you're not dinged for having "quote unquote" a bad reputation. It's just people just don't do business with you. It's like it's like Amazon.
Mm-hmm.
I look at Amazon as people tend to go to merchants that have higher reputations, and that's a very specific use case. Like I mentioned in my article, Mike might be a really great mechanic, but he might suck as a babysitter. So anyway, and I'm not going to even pretend that I have the answer to reputation. I've thought about it a lot. There's a lot of work to be done, and it's the hardest piece that has to be done correctly.
Yeah.
I see people who are talking about it, and I've seen some implementations that could work really well, but I'm going to avoid that topic for now, just because I can't speak with too much authority on it. I'm not aware of what's happening, but I wanted to say one thing, which is that in a competing global ecosystem of SOGIs, if the US managed to instantiate some kind of decentralized SOGI system, or there's the emergence of something like that, and it scales, and it sort of becomes a very strong phenomenon in the West, China doesn't stand a chance, because in that system, you have one that takes advantage of the potential of all of its human beings and knows how to regulate things based on merit, and it tolerates requisite diversity, which means it has more resilience and anti-fragility, versus one that's completely controlled from the top down. In that system, obviously, the one that's decentralized with requisite variety and maximizing potential of its individual agents is far more evolutionary stable than one that's controlled.
So there's a lot of hope in that. So and also several problems potential problems, like we're thinking a bit in the direction of, well, how do we design such a system? I want to design such a system, but it's maybe the wrong way of looking at it. I mean, can one design such a system, even though we're trying to design something that's totally self-organizing, collective intelligence, sort of bottom-up, by itself kind of thing? I mean, the moment you are designing it, you're sort of, in a way, imposing something on what's naturally there.
Yes. There's always this is the big warning that I always throw out there, even before I even begin the conversation. I've certainly had this conversation with different people, including Jordan, who we've talked, which is that the biggest mistake you can make is to have some notion of what you think collective intelligence is and bake it into the architecture.
And implement it for everybody. Everybody needs 5 levels of trust.
Yeah, and so a great example of it doing it absolutely wrong is Scenario. I mean, here's the thing, and I know I just dissed it, but let me say what is cool about it. It's brilliant. If you look at Scenario, the guy who came up with it is next level smart. There's just so many. It's just mind-blowing. It's just sort of this mind-blowing thing, and you can see how much of it's got it right. But at the end, there's all these mechanisms in there that basically lock it in. Well, what if somebody has a different idea of a mechanism? Too bad. The mechanism's in there. This is how people get upregulated.
That's the thing.
That's how people get downregulated. And you've baked it into the system. The much better idea is create the minimal architecture. And Scenario is just one way of an endless number of ways that people can do things. And so if people want to create a system like that, you can download it, and you can participate, and you get all the benefits and reap all the rewards and suffer the downsides of running a Scenario style collective intelligence. Or here's another way of doing it. And it sounds like it will be an absolute mess initially. Yes, it would. It's all messy. It's like you wouldn't have any standards. You'd have the minimal architecture so that there's thousands of collective intelligence sort of things that are sort of happening. And like I said, my my thesis is that over time, these things start to cohere. Apps that seem to work better or ways to do reputation are going to tend to scale better. And over time in this competing system, you end up with the right system.
Yeah. So the question is what the minimal...
Here's my minimal. And again, it could maybe be more minimal. But my minimal is that you have to, just like any complex system, start with the nodes. Well, what is the node? You know, the neuron, the person, whatever. And the idea is, how do I have a node that allows for on-ramping of these things? So I'm pinning my hopes on self-sovereign identity as being the good start of that. Self-sovereign identity brings back literally the sovereignty in terms of not only just identity, but in a lot of ways back to the user. So that the person has a node, a cryptographic shell, as it were, that allows them to start participating to whatever degree they want with anyone else. It's not controlled from the top down. It allows people to sort of start creating this. Think of it as the very base layer. You create a self-sovereign node. And again, my knowledge of the technical aspects of this is not sufficient to be able to render a deep and comprehensive verdict on it, except to say that the basic idea of a self-sovereign node is that I have a self-sovereign identity node. I can now start making connections with other people through different systems, so that you'd have, like, say, I guess you'd call it a dashboard. And the idea of the dashboard is it could be everything. It's like I can look at the web. I could go on something like IPVS, the decentralized network. And it's an open source system. It's like, oh, look, here's a Bitcoin plugin. So now on my self-sovereign identity node, I can pay anyone else, any other self-sovereign identity node through Bitcoin, because assuming they have Bitcoin, the Bitcoin, I communicate with that person and immediately I send Bitcoin from one self-sovereign identity node to another. This can include things like chat, video, whatever. So it's sort of this open ecosystem that people can build on top of.
Yeah.
And so the idea is that once that's in place, then that basic dashboard, that self-sovereign identity board, people start building different applications. And the next thing is people can start running different types of liquid democracy for news feeds, for example. It's like, okay, my news feed right now is I have all the different people I'm connected to on Facebook, and it has its own algorithm, which I have no idea what it is. That's determining based on what I like or don't like, based on its determination, what I'm going to see. I have some ability to pick the top 25 people, which helps, but unfortunately, I still end up getting into sort of a bubble. The way that I've countered this, and it's very time consuming, is every 6 months, I go to all of the people and everyone, all of my friends, and go through and look at their wall and see if there's anything on the wall that I like, and then like it. And that solves the problem for about 2 months. For about the next 2 months, my wall all of a sudden becomes this beautiful cacophony of diversity and interesting opinions. And sure enough, 2 months later, 3 months later, I'm seeing the same people again. It's incredible. But in this system, we would be able to at any time look at the back door. There would be different people would create these different algorithms. Well, here's an algorithm that does this, or here's an algorithm that does that.
So something like that. I agree. I mean, there needs to be a node or something that then you can add plugins to, and then that can sort of compete.
And you can build your own newsfeed. You have total customization of it. And one of the ways you could do it is through liquid democracy. It's like, for example, there's certain topics that you always seem to be so just on. And in those areas, I would maybe there would be things like semantic analysis, but either way I could say, okay, I want to see more of that from Flemming.
Yeah.
And then Flemming, if you delegate, you say, okay, here's somebody I find interesting. And even though I'm not friends with them, if that person publishes it, it's going to end up more likely on my newsfeed. There's all sorts of possibilities.
Okay,
there.
So I agree with something along those lines. What disturbs me is we've sort of moved away a little bit from that world where, like, 10, 15 years ago, and when everybody had blogs, it was sort of more, that was sort of the trend of, then you had a friend of a friend thing to keep track of your friends, and you sort of managed it yourself, and that was sort of an open source way of keeping track of it. Having your own identity would fit right in there, Whereas today, even if somebody has a bulletproof system, it's hard to get people away from Facebook or Instagram to even
Yes.
pay attention to it.
Yeah. So yeah, I mean, I guess one of the things you're thinking of is, I'm guessing, is stationary
RSS
RSS feed.
feeds,
It's
yes,
brilliant. The
brilliant.
potential for RSS was amazing. It's like, as soon as I really started to see and understand RSS, I realized you could do anything.
Yeah.
Man, this could really scale into something extraordinary.
So it doesn't mean that something like that couldn't happen again, but at the same time, we've moved away from that world. So it has to be done sort of at another level. But I love that kind of characteristics. It's you maintain it yourself. You have it on your own, in your own space, on your own server or something. It's open source. People can add modules to it, different ways of consuming it and generating it. So
Right.
something along those lines make.
Yes, right now, because self-sovereign identity is not fully developed, I don't see anything out there that has that capability. I see these other alternative social networks, and they're just variations on a theme. They're variations on the.
And
it's like, look, it's decentralized, but it's the whole user interface and everything is still more or less controlled by the people who develop it.
Yeah, and
here's another one. There's Mastodon. There's Gab AI. There's Steemit, and all of them are extremely limited.
Yeah, and they don't take off because nobody's really there other than
serious flaws. And every time I get on, the user interface is absolutely god awful.
Yeah,
and it's amazing to me because there is one thing people always ask me, and I could be wrong about this, but one of the things that I think made Facebook so successful so early on and got it to scale and get past that threshold where all of a sudden everybody wanted to be on it. It started that cascade effect, essentially, was that when you signed up, it could look at all of your email and immediately identify the 30 or 50 friends.
Yeah.
And then from there, it had an algorithm that said, hey, there are 3 of your friends who know this person.
Yeah.
So I had lost touch with, because of all where I've been, and I lost touch with the overwhelming majority of my friends from high school, for example. I lost all my yearbooks in a fire 15, 20 years ago. So it's like, I just had no idea how to find any of them. And I get on Facebook, and the first thing it does is it scans through my emails, and I get about 40 or 50 friends, and 2 or 3 of them said, oh, look, here's such and such. I'm like, oh my God, Gary, I haven't seen him in years, because 1 or 2 of my friends have been keeping in touch with him.
Yeah.
But then I'm friends with Gary, and then now that I'm friends with Gary, the algorithm worked even better and identified it more. And so within like a month, I had connected and reconnected with all these people, and I was hooked. Yeah. That's what hooked me.
So
that's
just that, I think you're right. I mean, that's what made it work, even though it was surprising. I mean, Facebook was just like computer.
Oh, but the user interface wasn't very good. But what hooked me is and it was so much better than all the other ones at that point, I think that was the key to their success. And every single one of these new social networks that I know of isn't doing that. It's like, what? They did this in 2005. It's 2018. You've had 13 years. Why aren't you doing the same thing?
And it sort of opens the door to doing a similar thing at a higher level. I mean, if you can come along with something that's a new, better solution, and somehow at an order of magnitude better than Facebook, you somehow find, well, not just people's existing friends, but something that, like, find all the resources in your whole network accessible.
I could see somebody creating, different sort of backdoor apps that allow somebody to, when you sign up, to connect to your Facebook network. Now, Facebook would see this as a threat and try to shut it down, but I could see a race, cat and mouse game. But it would last long enough that you could end up getting a shitload of people over there before they, what in the meantime. But I think that alone will help. And of course, just the other thing is that if it works the way I'm thinking, you will have a minimal critical mass of what I call the techno early adopter types, who will say, this is the next best thing. Mm-hmm. They're not doing that with these other ones, not quite yet. It has to reach a certain level where people say, this is the next best thing. There's so much freedom here, so much potential, so much you can just build on it. I mean,
it really has to do something much better. I mean, just making another network where you have
it has to have a capacity. It has to have that potential where early adopters come in and start building applications, and that brings in the next wave of early adopters, and then they build more applications, and there's more of a network, and then that brings in the little bit later adopters. That's the key. And I'm optimistic that if they can do it, it will happen indeed. But again, to supplant Facebook, you need something seriously better. At the very least, you have to be able to onboard your existing friends to some extent. So
the good news is, I mean, if the right thing is found, it's not a linear thing. It's like an exponential kind of thing, like Facebook. I mean, if you do something that's 10 times better than Facebook at connecting us with the world and the possible, with all our friends and with everything that's possible, if we somehow do that better, and it demonstrably works better, and there's an easy way of connecting everybody to it, it would just take off. But it really has to do that. It's not just sort of convincing people, oh, it's better because this is a little more open, or you get points for posting something, or it has to dramatically do something better.
If I had to take a guess, based on my understanding of the current scene, you know, whether it's the decentralized applications, blockchains, those kinds of things, and self-sovereign identity stuff, I would say we are no more than 3 to 5 years away from something like that truly happening. Like if assuming that this work keeps going, I think there's a high probability that within 3 to 5 years we will see something like that actually emerge. It's not pie in the sky stuff. That all the basic infrastructure is being built.
Totally, and it's not linear, so it's not just. I mean, it can happen very quickly. I mean, somebody's bright idea and a few weeks of work. I mean, just like back with the blog thing, and when Dave Weiner invented RSS and so forth. I mean, that's maybe sort of a weekend's thinking, not more than that, of sort of putting together, oh, let's just do this. I mean, it happened to be genius at the time, but it wasn't a lot of work. So somebody could come up with something that's clever and simple enough that it's not a matter of working on it for years, but it's just a matter of getting it out into the world, and everybody can see, well, really clearly this works better.
My concern, though, is I think what probably will end up happening, though, is that it will end up starting out slow because people have been saturated. Oh, yeah, I've heard of it. So let's say something actually superior has been created. It will start out with people saying, yeah, most people will just, even though they hear about it, they won't do it.
Maybe.
And then it sort of slip. I'm just guessing. It just seems like that's one possible scenario, is that it sort of sits there like spores underground. You don't see the mushrooms yet. It's just sort of the mycelia network is growing.
That would work too.
Then,
yeah, sort of. It's growing in your basement.
Yeah, and then all of a sudden it just pops up, and people go, "What?" You know, and all of a sudden it just blows people away.
Yeah, I mean, that could be cool too. So, I mean, that's another strategy. I mean, there's some things that are going to change the world, but they haven't caught on yet, like augmented reality and stuff like that. I mean, it's going to totally change our reality, but in a few years, and it's not yet cool enough to anybody really to bother much with it. So it could be a thing like that we follow the trend a little bit, and then we have it already built, the thing that's ready for when the technology is there. I don't know.
So if you're okay with this, I'd like to just slightly switch gears, which is that on a deep level, I think that what's happening, and this is just I'm really going to just go out on a limb here, which is that what I see happening currently is bigger. It's not just climate change. Something bigger and deeper is going on, and that collective intelligence is certainly a piece to this puzzle, and it's certainly a helpful direction. That it may not be sufficient to complete the transition. And given my background with all the things going on, I tend to take another view of which ties into the deep psyche, which is this: when I'm looking around, one of the things that I'm noticing is sort of the death of a lot of things. Not only a death of certain ways of life, but I'm seeing a death of like different epistemologies or different epistemic ways of knowing things. Like I see a breakdown of things that it's becoming increasingly more difficult to even know what the hell is going on. Mm-hmm. And I don't just mean like the news, I mean, period.
Yeah.
Like on a deep level, I don't even know what's going on anymore. It's starting to make me question things that I haven't questioned.
Yeah. Either
I question them in those brief moments in my life where I have those moments of questioning it, but I'm starting to question it on a deep level. Everything, And that can't help but upend things in the psyche and have an effect on the emotional situation, not only on my cognitive framework, but my emotional framework of, but I like my safety of knowing this is the way the world works, and this is sort of my model of things, or my meta model. But even that's getting upended, and so on certain emotional levels, it's been deeply disconcerting and even frightening. Again, not all the time. On most days I'm fine, but there are those moments when I take time out and I go out in nature and I meditate and I find that stillness, that I begin to wonder, is there something bigger, deeper, more profound happening? And so not only do I think of things like I guess what I'm saying is I'm beginning to lose a sense of separation between the deep ecology or the deep web that is happening in the world and the deep psyche, that there is something deep going on. It reminds me of Stan Grof's work. If you haven't heard of Stan Grof, he sort of is the voice that came after Jung. I think a lot of people, more and more people are coming to the realization that Grof sort of took that conversation that much deeper than Jung did. Jung sort of got into it, but then Grof took it much deeper and in a way that's quite rigorous. And he ties it into what he calls the perinatal, which is that when we look at the nature of the psyche and the nature of who we are as people, a lot of that is shaped during the perinatal phase of when we're born. And he spends hundreds and hundreds of pages mapping this out. When you see all of these different types of experiences that we have and all these different stages of consciousness, they all seem to be reflective of these perinatal stages. Are you aware of this? Are you aware of Grof's work?
I haven't looked much. I'm familiar with his name. I must have read some things, but not very much. But I have from other ankles familiarity with prenatal kind of stuff.
Yeah. So I'll just do a quick summary. So there are 4 stages of birth. The first one is, it's sort of oceanic. You're in this womb. You're one with everything. You're just, there's no separation between you and everything else. Everything's just homeostatic and blissful and oceanic. And then there's a shift happening. Something is, what's going on? There's change. There's change from what was just pure oceanic bliss. And the change gets more and more disconcerting. And what this is, of course, is the contractions of birth. The baby is now, there's turbulence, there's motion, don't get too comfortable. You're something changing. Obviously we know what this is heading, you're going to be born. But from the baby's perspective, there's a shift that happens that's completely unprecedented. And that shift gets more and more intense. And to the point where it's crushing. It's hot, it's hellish. Oh my God, why have thy forsaken me? There is no way out. This is the end. It's not like there's light at the end of the tunnel, because the light at the end of the tunnel is phase 3 of, you can see the opening of the birth canal. It's like, oh, maybe, just maybe there's a way out of this hellhole. But right now, no, it's just everything's coming crushing down. And I feel like that's what's happening right now. There's a sense of everything. Every day I read the news. Climate change, oceans heating, political instability. Bolsonaro just got elected in Brazil and he's going to destroy all the rainforest. It just goes on and on and on. It's like an onslaught. And I think people are, again, one of the things I look at people is deep down, how are they reacting? How would I react? And it's a combination of deep denial, delusion. I see so many people operating in these little flat fantasies. I'm not immune to this. I've been in my own little happy space. And it's getting harder and harder for me to be in that happy space. And it feels a lot like the stage 2, or what Grof calls the perinatal matrices 2, which is very similar to ego death. If you read, whether it's people who have done psychedelics or people who have had spiritual death and rebirth, the story of Jesus, Buddha, Buddha, goes through this 40 days in the night and desert, the dark night of the soul. I mean, there's this basic idea that transcends all cultures. It's existent everywhere. This is commonality of consciousness. And when the ego is lost, it feels like all is lost. You're losing everything. There's no.
But it's a transformation of some.
If you know that, yeah. But it can feel like it's the end.
Yeah. So now, okay. So yeah, I'm interested in looking at it ways like that, as sort of a current of what's happening as our collective evolution in a sense. I'll give a totally different angle on it, but which addresses that. I've written about it. It's still the latest article on my blog, which I haven't touched since 2014, but Ming.tv. But it's essentially, it's sort of a model, a theory I got once in some kind of channel lecture sometime in the 90s in California, which somehow I latched onto. And nobody else seemed to have heard about it, but it really explains a lot to me. It's the idea that humanity is going through sort of a collective evolution with different stages where things are sort of quickening, that it used to be, and it's often connected with the idea of moving into another dimension, although that doesn't make much sense in terms of physical dimensions, but we can call it dimensions or density, or some New Age people would consider it moving from the third to the fifth dimension. And
right.
And the model that goes with it is that in the third dimension, the way things are done is that first you get sort of the inspiration, the spirit or the inspiration to it. Then you form the thought of, hey, I want to do this. And then you get the emotion, you get into the mood for doing it. And then you expend some effort, you work on it. Like it used to be, you decided to do something and you work on it for years, and then eventually you get sort of the manifestation of it. If you work for 30 years, you might have built up some fortune kind of thing. That's sort of the third dimensional way. Things take time to do. There's effort involved and so forth. And actually what you feel about it doesn't make that much difference, because mostly it's the effort of the long work of getting somewhere that makes a difference. And the idea is that then it shortens into the fourth dimension. We cut off a step, so it goes from sort of spirit or inspiration into thought, into emotion, into manifestation. We cut off the years of hard work kind of thing. So it becomes more that the moment you really feel it, you pretty much have got it, which is kind of what happened in the age of the internet. It was no longer, the world became more fluid. It was no longer that you had to build up like a company over many years, like IBM. And it became more like somebody might become billionaires sort of in a couple of years just by coming up with something that inspired people, that people get really excited about. And then suddenly you have that because everybody's on Facebook, and suddenly you're a billionaire, the richest man in the world or something. So that's because we cut away sort of the effort, the hard work part. There's still work involved in doing it, but the game field changes based on emotion. Also negatively, a lot of people get really mad or angry about something, and suddenly there's a revolution and things change. So it's like revolutions get sparked really quickly, and then things change much quicker. It's much faster to change something. It grows more sort of exponentially. So that'll be the fourth dimension or fourth level of this. The next level, the fifth dimension, would be we cut off one more level. It goes from spirit to thought to manifestation. So you no longer need to sort of really get into the mood or feel it or be in touch with it. The moment the idea is there, it just sort of moves into action right away. It's like it goes for the moment something is thought clearly enough, it just spreads. Like whether it's true or not doesn't really matter. It just the world gets changed just by the thought. And the point of that is that would both be how things work in how we work and make things happen, and it would also be sort of internally that we used to have quite a buffer in things, like whatever you thought and felt didn't really make that much difference on what your role in life was. You needed to go to work and do the same thing anyway. Then it became more that actually you influence your life if you're really enthusiastic and gung-ho about something, you can make it happen. You'll get financing, and you got your company, and it's happening. And then it moves into whatever crazy idea you have. It just takes off right away, whether it's false or not. But the result of that becomes, if your thoughts and your feelings aren't very clear, if you just have sort of a bit of a mess inside and you're jumping all over the place, it's very difficult to live in a world where your thoughts sort of manifest very quickly. Like, I mean, whatever idea you have now, you go out on the internet and look for it. Oh yeah, they're like eating children in pizza parlors, and yeah, there are all these people talking about it. You take off very quickly and you go crazy with that. I mean, you get validated in your thought. It gets amplified if you don't have sort of an inner balance and sanity in it. So that's kind of what we're seeing now, that a lot of people are going crazy. They haven't necessarily done their personal work to be sort of emotionally and mentally well balanced in a world that's kind of chaotic or moving very fast. Whatever they can imagine, nightmare they can imagine, they can find some others who go along with that, and you'll have it right away. So
right, yeah, absolutely, yeah.
Which is kind of what we're seeing.
Yeah, and of course that's is definitely is its own existential risk.
So
which is that unless we get our shit together, that collective unconscious, collective insanity can wreak havoc.
Which is kind of what it does right now. So in a way, that prophecy is, if we consider that, is sort of carried out with, like, lots of people are going crazy now, and we find that half of the people we know are like insane, and we didn't realize it because they will like jump all around and be affected by whatever shows up, and whatever nightmare they hear about in the news, they're in on it right away, and they don't know what else to do. So.
Right. Yeah, this is a really interesting take on it. I mean, it's definitely, I see that everywhere, what you're saying. Exactly.
So I mean, one answer to it is that the answer is personal work.
Yes.
But also, according to that, I mean, I thought about it before the world was like that. I thought about that like 20 years ago, and from there it looked like at some point the world is going to go crazy and not everybody's going to make it, kind of thing. So like some people will just like go nuts and sort of blow themselves up. And
yeah, my concern is that there'll be enough crazy people that they'll take out huge amount, that the crazies will win.
Yeah, unfortunately,
they're killing half the population. I see people that are just itching, for example, for civil war.
Yeah, so crazy unfortunately people, they might take the rest of us with them.
Yeah, right, exactly. That is the prime existential risk that I'm afraid of, more than any other else. It's not the climate change. Climate change is bad in of itself. It's the reaction of people to climate change. It's the reaction to so you got climate change, which precipitates a refugee crisis, which precipitates political instability and fracturing, which precipitates what you just said, that magnifies and amplifies these crazy signals, and you end up getting genocidal gangs. I mean, I don't even want to speculate about what could happen, but it just seems like it could just completely blow up in our face. Totally. And to me, who I worry about, because I've thought about this deeply, if the shit hits the fan, I'm not so worried about climate change in and of itself. I'm worried about people's reaction to it. I'm worried about what happens if there's no food, the collapse, the breakdown of civilization, and this collective insanity. To me, it's like, how does one survive that? Well, I don't know. You lock yourself in a bunker that nobody knows about in Alaska. I don't know. It's
I don't know. It's pretty horrifying prospects.
It is a horrifying prospect, and that's sort of unfortunately where I see things going. I know other people are more optimistic. My friend says, "Oh, the West will be spared. Everybody's going to hurt. There's going to be suffering globally, but the West, with its infrastructure, will get the least blunt of it, or I should say, they'll get less of the blunt." I'm not so sure. To me, the West is very fragile with its complicated supply chains. And the West, with its centralized food systems, everything else, you can see the shores shelves empty within 3 days. We
don't have farms and stuff.
No. I spent time in Southeast Asia, and it's like there's food everywhere. I spent almost a year and a half in Southeast Asia, and it's like there's patties and rice and fruit. There's coconuts on the tree. Everywhere, it's an agrarian society for the most part still.
Yeah.
Most of Southeast Asia.
Yeah.
And if there's supply chain shocks, the Southeast Asians will, again, in that isolated variable, there's just a global supply chain shock, it seems to me that the third world countries that have these, that are agrarian based,
Yeah, they'll be.
and I'm not talking someplace in the Sudan that's in the middle of the desert necessarily, but I'm talking about these places. They seem to be more resilient,
Yeah,
anti-fragile.
yeah.
So,
Hmm. So now as to the positive angle, I
yeah.
mean,
So the positive angle, which is which going back to the BPM2, which reminds me of a Timothy Leary quote. You know, before he died, he I don't think he knew about global warming, but he did know about, maybe he did, but because he used he just used the word warming or heat, that the planet seems to have caught a fever.
mhm,
And he says, how do we know that the fever the planet has caught is not the fever of a mother giving birth?
mhm,
Because in some deep sense, that does seem to be what's happening.
yeah,
You know, the idea is that the fact that we're sending out humans uh, into these foreign alien environments opens up the potential of the biosphere replicating itself, that humans are the carriers, like the sperm or the egg or whatever, and they bring all the DNA of Earth and they go to a place like Mars or other places or space colonies, and they create new biospheres. That the Earth, which has been a singular organism, could be this is one, to my way, valid way of looking at the whole situation cosmically, is that the Earth biosphere is on the verge of potentially giving birth to thousands, if not millions, of
mhm.
baby biospheres.
So
Um,
yeah,
and that capability goes part and parcel with all the things we're dealing with, which is the technology and runaway, all these different, the technology and all of the problems that go with it. And that, yeah, it's bad, just like when a mother's giving birth to the child, and it's painful for the mother and the child, and it can feel like it's catastrophic, and it can in fact be fatal. And maybe that is the same situation we're dealing with. That maybe
yeah.
that's what's
So
happening.
I mean, it might be it might be that it by itself, not by us coming up with a clever solution, but that by itself, evolution sort of works it out this way. One possibility is that, I mean, part of what's breaking down is our sort of centralized way of dealing with it. We're trying to work as one sort of humanity that's solving these things in global warming, and we don't agree. We get polarized. We don't succeed in working together. And maybe the better solution is that it becomes impossible to even imagine any sort of one global media where we work it all out, that it fragments into millions of groups that are figuring out how to do things on their own, that it becomes unthinkable that there's sort of one correct way of doing it, because we're still in various ways trying to compete about what is the right way of thinking, what are the facts. I mean, is there global warming or not? Is this the right way of doing it? What should we be, left or right? And so we're trying to do one solution, at least in countries, and maybe that totally doesn't work. So maybe that all falls apart. So instead of one something that dies and that explodes into a million something that are not trying to be one global thing, but that are each doing their thing, and then potentially come at it again from another angle. So a million worlds instead of one, and each of those worlds figured out by their own thing. I mean, whatever their rules are, they can figure that out. So maybe that's somehow what
Are
happened.
you now, real quick? Are you talking about thousands or millions of worlds still
On
on the
this
planet,
world.
or
Yeah, on
okay?
this world. I'm talking
Yeah,
about that somehow it becomes, because of the acceleration of everything and the fragmentation of everything, it becomes impossible to even think of one something, that we sort of totally drop that idea that we can agree
yeah. Well,
going.
that comes full circle to collective intelligence, which is that a collective intelligence, if done right, where you have that happening, where you have the requisite variety of these different points of view, and
Yeah,
the ones that seem to be working and are beneficial to the individual in the whole are the ones that get upregulated, and the ones that aren't get downregulated. Because to me, without that, when you end up getting is a race to the bottom of thousands of competing worldviews, and each
yeah,
one, because they're not collective intelligent, are competing with the others for the dwindling resources, and
yeah,
you get the opposite. You get collective unintelligence,
yeah,
and a world that ultimately ends up as a Mad Max situation. Because
yeah.
you get and I'm just going to say something real crazy, but it's backed by an interesting new theory that's making the rounds in the anthropology world. Apparently, sometime between 9 and 11,000 years ago, there were 17 women for every man in the human species.
Mm-hmm.
That at that point in time, 8 of 18 people on the planet were women. And anthropologists had never really come up with a viable or what they felt was a good explanation, which is interesting. But this Chinese student, he's Chinese, but he's in America, I think, and he just got his degree, an undergraduate degree, and he published his thesis, and it's taking the anthropology world stream. They actually think it's probably the right answer. It's developing consensus, and the idea was that because of that back in those days, it was a strongly patriarchal system and the men trying to dominate would kill all the other men. Basically, the groups of them would kill off all the other men. They didn't want to kill off the women because those are potential mates. So over time, it resulted in one man for 17 women. And they say this is actually the explanation of why the population today is 51% women and 49% men, that even though 50% of people born are women and men, that it's still, I don't know the exact explanation, but there's still a slight difference in population, apparently. Anyway.
Crazy.
Yeah, it's crazy, but my concern is that we end up there again.
Yeah, so I mean, our hope is, I think, that whatever scenario plays out, that it creates the circumstances for a collective intelligence to happen, that maybe that kind of diversity is needed. Maybe we do need to sort of fragment in order to actually act collectively intelligent, because most of what we're talking about and most of what's being talked about on the world stage is leaning towards like one solution fits all. What are we going to do about global warming and whatever, which maybe isn't the way of thinking about it.
I think it's painfully obvious that one size fits all solutions never work. I mean, it's something as simple as gun policy. It's like some communities seem to do just fine in America by having lots of guns, and they have almost no violence because they have a culture of, like, if you go to some place like Montana, it's like, I got my rifle and a couple of guns, and and you have other places where it just doesn't work at all. And so this idea of having a federal policy of guns doesn't seem to be working. Why not leave it up to these communities to decide what works? Some communities have realized that guns need to have more strict gun policies.
Yeah.
In places out like in Wyoming, they really don't need to. It's just not a problem there.
Yeah. So I think somehow that the diversity needs to be sort of allowed and included, and that can either happen by somehow coming up with a political organizational system that is like that. That's not so likely, or it happens by things fragmenting. Or by somehow us finding space in other places. Like now there's sort of more virtual spaces. It doesn't have to be geographical. You can somehow create communities across boundaries. So there could be a way of succeeding in creating diverse communities without worrying too much about where people live, although I don't quite see it yet. But one of these things might give
apparently there's already sort of a growing, at least in the States, there's a growing realization to move back towards localism. Mm-hmm. Even David Brooks, the conservative columnist, wrote an article about this, where he talked about the sort of quiet renaissance that's happening in communities across the country, where they're revitalizing their towns and they're relocalizing different things, and there's more civic participation at the local level because people see they really can't have an influence there. Mm-hmm. And he actually talks about how, back in the early 19th century, the Whig Party, that was pretty much their whole foundation, was this sort of localization, sort of Jeffersonian idea. Mm-hmm. of localized decision making and what the Catholics call subsidiarity, where decision making is left at the local level mostly. And this, to me, this needs to happen anyway, for us to have anti-fragile and resilient civilization. It needs to be decentralized. If you have more food production that's local, as we talked about, mm-hmm. then supply chain shocks to food are less likely to cause problems. Decentralized energy, then shocks to the power grid are less likely because more power is being generated locally. So on and so on.
Yeah. So the question is just how we best get there. I mean, is that some new political movement of doing that? Is it some inventions that make it likely? Like, if it becomes more practical to have local energy or local manufacturing machinery and so forth. I mean, there are trends going in that direction, of course. It would be better if it was like that than by the total breakdown of society, of course.
Because there's certainly already a breakdown of the national narrative. I mean, it's already, as far as I'm concerned, it's done. There's no longer, as John Robb talks about, there's no longer a unified, what he calls fictive narrative or fictive idea of we're all Americans or we're all French or Germans. I can't speak to other countries about this, but in America, certainly there's a breakdown.
But the same idea, weirdly, there's then a recurrence of like strong authoritarian leaders who will be very nationalistic, who will still try to make us all American.
Unfortunately, there are people on both sides that are increasing rhetoric towards imposing their idea of what they think America should be on everybody.
Yeah, but that might be the last gasp because it really isn't practical any longer.
I think it's I based on people, because I know there are people in my social circle and I'm friends with them, know them, who are speaking that language. And my take on it is this is their emotional reaction to this BPM2 thing. It's just a self-protective, like, oh my God, things are breaking down. Okay, I'm going to hang on even tighter to my ego.
Yeah.
It's exactly what happens. It's like, I need to hang on to what I know. I'm not going to let this go. Oh my God, I don't want to lose it. Yeah. America, we go to church. If you're Republican, you go to church. You have a strong military. Or the liberals are going to
more discipline.
Holding on to this idea. Yeah. And again, otherwise intelligent people. I look at people like David Brin, who I've known for 35 years, and who I've respected a lot of suspense. He's holding on so tight to the whole establishment blue church. And he's right. It did amazing things. After World War II, there's amazing things that the blue church, liberal democracy, and the technocratic system did to increase the well-being of people all over the world in the States. But that system is failing utterly.
It's not really there.
And I tried to explain to him the reason that we're seeing so much political dissatisfaction, and the reason that Hillary lost is in large part because that church, that system, is no longer helping enough people to not get them elected.
Yeah.
And they don't see that. They're doubling down.
Yeah.
He told me I was a Russian bot. He was a Kremlin troll. He told me that you're just one of those divisive. No, I'm just trying.
Yeah, so I mean, that might be a hope too, that it's the last sort of gasp of holding on, and then it's suddenly maybe is going to become more clear that that's just not.
And Jordan's saying, the sooner we recognize the blue church is dead, and the better off we'll be. And unfortunately, the red religion is no better ultimately. I think its alternatives suck.
It might take it a little longer to realize that
because it's in the trenches more. It's more robust in terms of its organization. So it will probably take a while before that sort of dissipates. Yeah.
Anyway.
Well, that was a good conversation. I don't know if you want to disagree now.
We got around a little bit. Well,
so,
good.
Yeah, I guess my own response to this, my personal response is doing the emotional work and doing the spiritual meditative work. It's spending time in nature, taking time for silence and reflection, and working on cultivating and nurturing relationships. I say I have two primary tiers. Those are the people that I actually deal with in meet space, that are friends and family that there's nothing like meeting somebody in person and just having a beer with them or having a conversation with them or going on a hike with them. It's just invaluable. And then my second tier would be those people I'm most fond of and care about and respect, that unfortunately are far away, and that, like you and me, keep in touch through the internet in one way. And that layer one and layer two is where I've put my time in terms of relationships.
I think that's part of the answer. I mean, for me too, I notice I'm a lot more focusing on myself in another way than I have for a long time, more focusing on being on my own evolution and more being present with myself, getting more clear on what I'm doing and what my thing is. And I'm also focusing more sort of on small groups. Like part of what I think needs to work is that small groups of people need to be able to have conversations that actually work. And that is hard enough. I mean, it's hard enough even for a group of friends that basically are sort of on the same page to actually have a productive conversation. That's strangely difficult to have that without
Mm-hmm.
getting lost in distractions and disagreements. So I'm working a bit on that, on trying to have more conversations that work and finding ways of doing them at a sort of a deeper level of actually learning something and actually looking for what's sort of ready to happen. So those are sort of more modest activities than creating the system that will change the world. But I think that's part of the way forward. We might still end up inventing a part of it. I'm optimistic about playing some kind of part, but I think it starts by sort of modeling it locally, like what do relationships of trust look like? How do you honestly look at what your role is and what's going on and what's working and what's not working? That's not that easy.
Mm-mm.
So a lot of it.
No, it's tough work. It's shadow work, as Jung talked about.
Yeah.
And it's having to be ruthlessly honest with oneself and to do the emotional work, which is very difficult. I'm very grateful that I have tools in that respect.
Yeah. So me too. And I just part of what, as we talked about, part of what's wrong in the world is a lot of people haven't even thought of that, or they don't have any tools, or they deny it, or they just think they're right, or somebody else is. So it's just difficult to persuade everybody in the world to do their emotional work.
Well, I believe that if we can cultivate the proper stillness, as it were, that sort of does act as sort of a contagion. It's like it does have an effect on those around us.
I think that it's possible to strike a certain vibe, and that can be contagious. And there's a certain sanity that can come from that, from being able to be still and work on what you need to work on, and presently looking at what's there to deal with, including what's going on in the world.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Okay, so hopefully we were some kind of example of that. I don't know, but it was an interesting discussion.
For sure. Okay, well, until next time then.
Until next time.
Namaste.
Namaste.